What's the most that you would pay for an asset for your game? Maybe a Unity asset off the Unity asset store, or if you're using Unreal, perhaps that's a UE4 or maybe UE5 asset off the marketplace. I think for me, that would have been probably 20 bucks. I'd love to hear your opinion in the comment section below, maybe before I start giving my opinion. Maybe if you could just write it, and then I'd love to see if your opinion changes over the course of this video, because I'd like to make some arguments, because I think that it's a lot higher than I would have initially said. And I would have initially said 20 bucks because that's sort of what I associate as kind of like the bar of discretionary spending. If I'm going to go see a movie and, get the movie ticket with the popcorn, that whole shebang, I'd figure that'd be, 20 bucks or less. And if I'm going to go, to Applebee's and get a 2 for 20 meal with the boys, maybe have a beer, that's probably 20 bucks or less, right? That's sort of what I'd assume is like the discretionary spending, at least for me, in my comfort level economically. And then if it's more than that, then it's like, oh, okay, I'm buying an experience, right? If I'm going to buy a dinner for, 50 bucks, then I would expect it to be at a nice restaurant with maybe an exceptional chef or an exceptional ingredients, or it comes with a show or something. I don't know. I would just expect a little bit more for, over 20 bucks. And so that was sort of the mindset I was in when I was thinking about what's the most I'd pay for an asset. But I think there's another way to look at it, which, and again, I'm a hobbyist, so I'm making these games for fun. I guess I should say, if you're new to the channel, my name is Matthew Ventures, probably obvious given the title, and I'm a AAA gameplay engineer for the last few years. I'm currently working at a Microsoft first-party studio on an unreleased, unannounced game, but I also do indie work, and I've been an indie Unity dev for the better half of a decade now, probably 6 or 7 years at this point. And I've seen Unity come and go, up and down. And again, most of my work has been hobbyist. We've made not enough money from the games for it to be full-time, for sure. Barely enough to keep the business afloat, frankly. But what I would say is that when I am evaluating these assets, I was kind of coming at it from this perspective of like, yeah, this is my hobby, this is for entertainment. But another way to think about it is the time savings that an asset can present. And I think that's actually pretty compelling for a higher price hike, because let's say you're working in the games industry or otherwise, and maybe you're going to value your time at, let's say, 20 bucks an hour. And that's kind of arbitrary, because if you're working in quality assurance, your hourly rate could easily be, like half that. And if you're coder, engineer, then your hourly rate could easily be maybe 2 or 3 times that, but let's just say 20 bucks. And so if the asset can save you 2 or 3 hours, then that's, 40 bucks or 60 bucks right there of your time worth, right? And so of course your professional time is measured differently than like, time for something that's just for fun. But if you want to kind of treat it as a business, then that's another way that you could think about it. And if there's an asset that's, 500 bucks and you're valuing your time at like 50 bucks an hour, then it could easily be worth it if it's going to save you at least 10 hours on the project. The current project I'm on, we're currently at 666 hours, which is kind of an exciting satanic number. Let me see if I can pull that up here. Oh, I'm sharing the wrong screen. It's this one. And let me pull this out of the way. So yeah, if I go into my project here, and this is I have all my hours logged, as I've showed you guys before, through this a custom just auto logger I have. But if I just pull that up, of those 666 hours, 1/6, pretty much 100 hours, has been spent on Opsive. Okay, and so that's the second asset. It's funny, actually, the number one thing, which has been 160 hours, was an asset I bought off the asset store called Photon, and that's actually free. The Photon Unity networking package, which is the replacement for Unity's default networking package, which is beyond horrible. But Opsive is the second thing, and I've spent, it says 89 hours I've spent on Opsive, and pretty much all of that was just setting it up. Okay, that includes the initial install, and then the other 87% of that time was in the integration, which is basically just getting it to work. And I have to say that for an asset that took almost 100 hours to get working, it did leave me very frustrated. And it's probably one of the most frustrating assets in that I've worked with. And I'll talk to you about why and why it may or may not be a good fit for your project. But I'll just right off the bat, I'll say that there was definitely a lot of complications I ran into. And so this asset, let's pull it up over here. The asset that I bought specifically was called Pun Multiplayer. Oh no, sorry, it was called the Third Person Controller. So my game is a top-down view third person controller game. And it's also a networked game, so I should mention that I also bought this little add-on here for another 25 bucks. So in total, I guess you could say it was 140 bucks, something like that. Yeah, 140 bucks for the two assets. And yeah, I would say that the reason why I went with this asset was because I knew right off the bat my skill set was not in 3D animation. So I am a gameplay engineer, but I don't know how to rig. I don't know how to technically animate. And so that's another factor that you might want to consider if you're thinking about a large budget asset, is whether or not you could even do the work, right? Because sure, you could teach yourself maybe how to become an artist or how to be a rigger or how to do some programming, but all those things take a lot of time as well. So one of the main considerations I think for any asset is yeah, sure, how much time does it save you? But if you don't even have those skills, like I could make a third-person character controller on my own if I wanted to. But let's say I didn't know how to program, well, then you'd have to first learn how to program, which is kind of a big hurdle, right? So it could be way more than that. So yes, it's taken me over 100 hours to kind of get this thing working and to fix all the shit that was wrong with this asset. But I would have never been able to create such a robust 3D animation system without it, right? And so it's kind of bittersweet in that sense. And all the more reason, I think, why it's important to consider what other alternatives there are. So this is a third-person character controller system, basically. And there are a few available on the Unity Asset Store. And one of the most frustrating parts of working with the Unity Asset Store, which is something I'd like to talk about as well, is their return policy is basically, you know, the worst return policy you could ever imagine. The Unity Asset Store's return policy is somewhere between non-existent to complete shit. For reference, let me see if I could pull this up here. So if you're on the Unity Asset Store, let's say I want to buy this agility pack, you might pop it open here. And they have a nice big checkbox here with a green shield arrow to say, yes, this asset is covered by the Unity Asset Store refund policy. Please read 293. And you're like, oh, well, damn, that's great. I'm protected, right? But if you go to the EULA, actually I haven't pulled this up in a while. Let's do it now. I'll be prepared to eat my words if they've changed it since then. Because obviously, yeah, okay, no, they haven't. Let's pull this up here. So their refund policy is basically there is no refund. Okay, all sales are absolute final, and there shall be no refunds except as required by law. So their refund policy is fuck you. You're not getting a refund, bitch. That's basically what their refund policy is. However, you can request a refund in the only case that they accept refunds is if basically the asset store creator outright lied to you. Okay, if this was like literally fraud, then they'll be like, okay, fine, you can have a refund. But any other case, it's nothing, right? So basically, yeah, if it's not as advertised, or you know, it's fucked up beyond comprehension, right? So sorry, I'm getting a little heated here, right? Because it's just fucking bullshit, right? that they have the audacity to say, oh yeah, it's covered by our refund policy. You click the link, you go to the refund policy, and it's just a middle finger. It's like, yes, section 2.9.3, fuck you, right? It's so frustrating, right? One of the worst refund policies possible, basically. There is no refund policy, let's be honest. And that's very frustrating because they try to communicate so well that, oh yeah, you're protected, but you're totally not. You're totally screwed. And back in the day, let me go back to here. Back in the day, that was okay because Unity had, if you downloaded a Unity asset, it would work in Unity. But the truth, nowadays, is Unity has so many parallel pipelines for their stuff. Like they've got like 3 different render pipelines right now that you could download a graphic shader that's just not cross-compatible with the render pipeline setup that you're using. And that could be really frustrating. It was an experience that I had where basically I had downloaded this custom shader, but because I was using URP or LWP, whatever it's called, the graphic shader didn't work for my game. And I went back to the asset store listing, and you read the fine print, right? Squeezed over here down in the package content, you got to click through these 2 buttons, and it says, not supporting Unity LRP version 6.0 plus, right? And so if you don't find that little freaking thing, it's like, oh yeah, doesn't work. And so, yeah, the asset store, it'll list what supported Unity versions there are, but it doesn't support what render pipelines. It doesn't list what render pipelines are supported, right? So it's kind of on the asset store creator to list that in the description, and oftentimes they don't. So that's very frustrating, and I think that's one of the that's sort of like a compounding issue with the status of like these high budget Unity asset store items here, is that if you're not happy with your purchase, and frankly, I was not happy with the Opsive purchase. Yes, I worked it out, and it took 100 hours to get that shit together. And frustration, and I had to hire people off Fiverr to help me like understand what the heck was going on. But so I'm sure the actual cost at the end of the day was much more than that. But if I had the opportunity to try out different third person controllers and assess, which one was going to be the right fit for my game, I would have been in a way better situation, And I think that's definitely something that Unity can improve. And it's something that I think they're already doing to some extent, right? Because one of the threats here, we want some fraud prevention, is that you're worried that maybe someone will download the asset, whether it's code or a 3D model or otherwise, and they might save it to some sort of shared memory drive, then say, oh, I'm done with the asset, return it, renew it, remove the information, but actually they still have it copied on their drive, and then they'll just copy it over after the subscription ends. And the last thing I would want would be some sort of pernicious DRM that's going to impact the end user, right? But as I was going to say, Unity already is on a trust-based system for their licensing, right? So when it comes to paying Unity at the end of the year, it's already a trust-based system on whether or not you self-report making over, I think it's 100K a year in order to get the Unity license. So for that factor alone, it lends credence to the idea that it's possible, or that they could, try to extend the licensing requirements in such a way that they could have a somewhat competent refund policy. Because it's already the case that they have like per seat licenses and stuff like that within the asset store. So those are just some thoughts on that, I guess. But ultimately, let's say you're going to buy the asset and you're not assuaged by the whole refund policy concern. Then the next thing that I would be thinking about for a large, big budget asset is what the documentation looks like online. And so Opsive has not good documentation. They have some online documents, which I've certainly read through. It's sort of, and they have a forum, which I think is actually a very good forum. So they're pretty quick to respond for that. But as me, as a YouTuber and as an audiovisual learner, for me, I'm always going to the YouTube to try and find like tutorials. And I found that Opsive actually has a surprising lack of YouTube tutorials. So that would be, they actually do have official YouTube tutorials, but they're not very good. And I think they know that they're not very good because all the comments on those videos are disabled. So you can't actually respond to any of them or, ask questions, with time codes and stuff like that. You'd have to go to their own walled garden, a forum support page. But I think that's actually a really good tip, is that if you're looking at an asset, go on YouTube and see whether or not people are creating tutorials for this asset, people who are not the creators of the asset. Because if other people are like me, who, I'm like a content creator when it comes to Unity, if people like me are making tutorials on how to use the asset, then it's usually indicative of like, oh, okay, somebody has enjoyed this enough that they want to share it with someone else, right? So I think that's usually a good sign. And that was actually the case. I want to say right now, before I get into some of the specifics, I totally do not believe that Opsive is a bad company, or that this asset is like reflective of their full portfolio, because though this asset was not good and has a lot of problems, at least it's below the bar, I would say, certainly. They have other assets which are really awesome. So let me share my screen again. It was recently the case that I was again on the asset store trying to find a behavior tree setup. And behavior trees, if you're not familiar with them, are sort of a visualization tool for creating AI behavior. It's a way to visualize the behavior in something called a behavior tree. And so there was basically no competitors when it came to the behavior trees. I couldn't find anyone else who really had a competent asset that had the sort of runtime debugging support that I wanted. And so I downloaded this behavior designer asset with a lot of apprehension, because I had just spent over $100 on their other asset and I got fucked, right? So I downloaded this asset thinking, oh shit, here we go again. This might be a lot of pain. And I was delighted. I was overjoyed, because this asset is badass. Seal of approval. It's a good asset. It has certainly, saved me 90 hours worth of work. I mean, probably saved me, it probably saved me like 50 hours worth of work. So the behavior designer is a great asset. And it's so modular, it supports stuff, and I could talk about it more. I don't want to get too much into it, because that's not what this video is about. I'm talking about a different one. But I just want to say that, like, in that case, it was definitely worth it. And one of the things you'll notice for behavior trees for everyone, this asset, versus the third-person controller asset, is there is a significant difference in how much YouTube content is. I couldn't find anything really for the third-person controller. So I think that's saying something, that so many people are engaging with this. I wonder if the reviews are substantially different either. No, it's about the same number of reviews and same quality for either. So I think I would recommend that as sort of as an external metric to kind of think about, who's making content on this, who's making tutorials outside of the creators themselves, because I don't think the reviews give you the full picture. Yeah, so this one has 700 reviews, this one has 500, so it's fairly comparable, but when it comes to the YouTube, it is actually a huge difference. So that's just something to keep in mind. Something else I'll note, and this is something that you should be aware of, is that this particular asset creator has, I think it's a bit of a bad practice of, they have a lot of DLC for their assets that you have to pay for. So this default asset I bought for $115, but then I also bought the pun multiplayer add-on for another $25 because I needed a multiplayer support. Wound up not using any of that, but I thought it would be useful at least to look at the code, and it turned out not really to be very useful. But I think that's also something to consider, because you might not get the full thing that you bought. You might actually have a lot of things that you would expect to be included in the asset. For example, you might expect with a third-person controller for it to support swimming. Certainly if swimming and it was in the demo or in the YouTube videos on their website, but it turns out that this could be a whole nother asset that you got to buy another $15 for, right? So that could be a very frustrating realization if that's the case, right? So I haven't seen that too often. I think it's a particularly naughty thing that they've done here, but it's just something to think about. So when it comes to the asset itself, when you're looking at the asset, I actually wrote down a bunch of notes here when I downloaded it like half a year ago. Let me see if I still have some of those notes. I'll just switch over to Cam as I chat a bit. But some of the frustrations with that asset was it was very brittle. It was an asset that did not have a lot of flexibility beyond exactly the way it was initially set up. And I think that could be very frustrating. Of course, it's always a challenge to think about who is the target audience for this asset, because on the one hand, you have people who basically don't know how to program, right? So they want, or in the case of like an art asset, they don't know how to do any art. So you basically, for those people, you just want to be able to plop it into your game and have it run, right? On the other hand, you have people who are highly technical or who know about art in that other example, and they want to go in and edit the asset. They want to improve, they want to add to it. And in those cases, you know, those power users, it could be a very different way that you design your asset in order to support that. And so it would just be the case, it was the case in the case of Opsive, in the case of this asset, that this asset was very much like non-conducive to extension, and they had a ton of stuff that was sort of jam-packed into this asset, so that the result that you got felt, and this is going to sound a little bit, I'll explain it in a moment because it's going to sound oxymoronic. It's going to sound like I'm contradicting myself, but it felt bloated and like something was missing at the same time. Let me explain. When it comes to how it felt like something was missing, I'll show you that as I alluded to before, let me see, where did I put this thing? As I alluded to before, I had purchased this thing, the third person controller. So that only comes with third person support. But they have a different asset called the ultimate character controller, which is for over twice the price. And the difference? Well, basically it's first person and third person. So you could separately buy third person here, or you could buy first person, or you could get the ultimate, which is both of them. And maybe other stuff as well, I'm not sure. But the frustrating part of this asset was they didn't it's not like the code was very modular. They literally just cut out parts of it or commented it out in such a way that when you go into the third person controller, it feels like this asset was the ultimate character controller, because that's what it's sharing all the same like physical assets and stuff like that. But the code is basically the ultimate character controller with part of it cut out, like the first person controller was cut out. And so that does feel like something was missing, because all of the assets are set up to support a third person controller. And as you may know from game development, it's a very different approach when you're going to be creating a first person character versus a third person character. In a third person experience, the view model is totally different. You might have the guns in a different position, etc. And so it was actually the case for the third person controller that they included all of the first person view model assets, which even though the support for first person was cut out, it did severely bloat the code and the Unity project, because now I've got all of these like floating hands weapons, and there was 3 versions of every single weapon. Now, maybe you could understand 2. I think 2 is like, it's more than it should be, right? It should just be 1 for the third person. But you would think, oh, okay, so it was 2 because it also had this first person stuff. So yeah, that sucks. But what are you saying, 3? Did I hear you correctly? Did you say 3? Yes, I did. 3. There was 3 instances of every single weapon, because not only do they have the bloat from the half dead first person code that they cut out, but they also have an entire inventory system that is included here. And keep in mind, you're not buying an inventory system, right? That is clearly their other, asset, which is another, screw you, right? $90 if you want to get that one. But you're just getting a third-person controller, but it's not a third-person controller, right? It's all this other shit crammed in there. And so, yeah, in the scene, every single gun is your equipment gun. That's a model. Then it's your first-person handgun, and then it's your third-person gun. So as you can see, it's bloated to 3 times the size it needs to be. And it doesn't just stop there with the inventory system inclusion. There's also, again, I don't know if this is another thing that they sell. No, it's not. But there's another thing that they have. Let me see if I could find it here. Where did I put this? Here. This is actually a screenshot from the component. I know this looks kind of crazy, right? There's 22 components on this game object, by the way, which we could talk about in a second. But you'll notice that a lot of these are not even necessarily related to having a third-person controller. So they have a lot of so yeah, they have an inventory system here, which, by the way, if you remove it, the game crashes. So that's what's so frustrating is like, yeah, it's all this code bloat. But if you try to remove pieces of it, this is why it took me 100 hours to get this shit running. It's like as you're trying to pull out all this crap that you don't want in the asset, it breaks, it crashes, and you have to circumvent it with custom scripts in order to get this thing to work, right? They have character respawn logic, character health logic, a perspective monitor, which I think is the case for switching between third and first person. Totally unnecessary, right? If you're just the third person. What else do they have? They have the item handler, which could be needed. And then they have the character foot effects. So there's like some VFX and footstep sounds, perhaps. And then, of course, the pun stuff is all just for the networking. But as you can see, there's a lot of stuff here that does not have a place in a third-person character controller. And then if we're going to talk a little bit about having a monolith monobehavior, I mean, not a monolith monobehavior, a monolith game object that has, again, it sounds like hyperbole, but literally over 20 different monobehaviors on this game object. Yeah, that's frustrating, right? It's frustrating only because it's so non-modular, right? There's nothing inherently wrong about having a game object that's got a lot of monobehaviors on it, right? That could be a very fine and very efficient way for you to set up your game project. But there are some cases where that's not possible and where you wouldn't want to do that. Perhaps because some monobehaviors are going to have independent callbacks for Unity's magic reflection methods. That's one reason, because that's on a per game object basis. Another reason could be if maybe you want to have game objects with different layers or different tags. That's a game object specific specification. So you may be in a situation where you want to have different monobehaviors on different objects for that case. And another issue too is if you want to have sort of like selective activation and deactivation on a game object level. So you want to selectively activate and deactivate multiple similar components, or I should say related components, then you might want to do that on a game object level. So there's a lot of reasons why you might want to do that, right? But the code for this asset was designed in such a way that that's not possible. Okay, and here's why. Because a lot of the asset here is dependent on get component, which is get component is a Unity call, which basically you just do like game object.get component, and what that will do is it will get you the first component of this type on the game object, and also that's not very efficient, so you should cache that. But especially if you're gonna go through a list of 22 components, Jesus. Sorry, tangent. Getting to the point. If you're doing these get components all over in the code, it's assuming that the transform is sharing the different components. And so when you move these monobehaviors to different transforms or different game objects, same thing, you're now in an issue where all the get component code is failing, so it doesn't work. So if you were gonna have a game object with multiple monobehaviors, the way that you'd set it up here, I could show you an example from my code. The way that you're supposed to set this up is you would do something like so here I have a field of view object, right? And a pawn logic and a combat object and a locomotion object and a animation object, right? And so these are all different monobehaviors on separate game objects, but they don't have references to each other. They all instead have reference to one object called the pawn services. And so within pawn services, it's basically just a wrapper where you can ask pawn services for a reference to the pawn logic, right? So now pawn logic doesn't need to have a relationship between locomotion and combat and all this other stuff. Pawn logic could just say, I mean, we could probably find an example of it, but pawn logic will just say something like services dot cur input, and then it can pull whatever it wants from that service, right? Or it'll say services dot fov dot is visible. And so that's the way that you can have a similar, it's the same level of visibility, but it removes, it's one layer of abstraction, right? It removes this requirement of having all the mono behaviors on one transform. So again, we're like super in the weeds here. This is getting very technical, but if you want to know like why an asset has in issues like this, right? It often does come down to like these very like I wouldn't say minute, but they are specific issues that are going to come up again and again and again, right? And so when you're trying to do like code maintenance for this stuff, if that's just, you know, hell in a handbasket, I think is the phrase, right? It's just a lot of pain. Another issue there also, I'll just say, is that Opsive relies very heavily on using Unity's awake and start methods for initialization, which is, I think, the way we all start coding in Unity, right? Is you're going to have everything in the start method, but probably one of the first things that you're going to do as you become an advanced Unity user is you're going to build your own initialization pipeline. And so you might not necessarily want an asset to initialize itself as soon as it's spawned. And especially in a multiplayer game, it's not always the case that you want to have stuff initialized as soon as it's spawned, because you might want to, you know, add additional setup data, or you might be awaiting a network confirmation or some other signal that has some sort of delay before you go forward with the initialization process. And so that's kind of frustrating, because since it has all those hooks on Unity's, you know, start method and on awake method, there's no way to differentiate between instantiation and initialization, and that's frustrating, because that shouldn't be the case, right? And I guess that really comes back to the same thing at the end of the day, which is just that, you know, when you download an asset, you want it to be as modular as possible, and when you're spending extra money, you expect that money to be invested in trying to save you time, right? The better the asset is, the less time of yours it's going to soak up, because you're not going to be wasted, you know, fixing all this nonsense, right? Whereas you're probably not expecting to get a whole bunch of bloat, a whole bunch of half-removed assets from their other packages that they're trying to upsell you and sell you DLC that has to plug into the asset and all this other crap, right? So I think that's kind of the frustration. It's just because, yes, it's clear that the people who've worked on this asset have put a ton of time and effort into this, and you know that their engineering chops are great when you look at some of their other assets, assuming they're made by the same people. But it's frustrating to know that that time investment has not gone into the correct things, right? And so you're left with a character controller that's so much more than a character controller, in the worst way, in the worst meaning of the phrase, right? So that's my experience buying an asset that was worth over $100 on the Unity Asset Store. What's the most expensive asset you've purchased? What is the most expensive asset on the Unity Asset Store? I have no idea. Is that something I could check? I'm not frankly sure. But would you be willing to pay $1,000 if you got maybe, I don't know, what would $1,000 asset be to you? You know, what I'm thinking is maybe if it's like a complete game, and then you can just resell it or reskin it and then sell it, would that be worth it to you? What if what if it's like I don't know. I'm frankly not sure, right? What $1,000 asset would be or what that'd be worth to you. I just spent several $100s on some 3D assets from Cinti Studios, right? And again, I'm not a 3D animator or a 3D artist, so there's no way I could have made that stuff. But I'm investing, hundreds of bucks on that because I know I'm going to use it and it's going to provide a lot of value to my game. So would you be comfortable spending that much money? And if not, why not? You know, because you don't think it's worth it, or just because you think it's too much to spend on a hobby, or or what are your thoughts on that, right? I would say that there's some pretty expensive hobbies that you can get into, right? So for example, I have some friends who like to shoot guns, right? And so there's an ammo shortage right now, so that could be very expensive to go out to the shooting range and like shoot some bullets, right? And obviously guns can be expensive too. And I would say relative to some other hobbies, maybe guns are expensive, but I'm not sure. But relative to other hobbies, I think game development for me has actually been not very expensive when it comes to the monetary concern. For me, it's been expensive when it comes to the time investment, right? Because it's just, 600 hours, right? Geez, that's a lot. And so um, I think that spending a little bit more money, if it means saving me time, is almost always going to be worth it. Especially when it comes from a asset creator who's providing me with a skill that I just don't have, right? There's no way I'm going to be able to do this cool third person character controller animations if it wasn't for the help of Opsive, right? The question at the end of the day isn't whether or not I needed an asset like this. It's whether or not this was the right asset. Compare it to other third person options that were available. And yes, I'll say it once more, options that I wasn't able to try because of Unity's non-existent refund policy. So those are all my thoughts in a nutshell. I'll probably make I'm open to making more videos on this to kind of exploring some of the smaller topics, but yeah, in a nutshell, those are all my thoughts on sort of big budget spending, if you consider $100 big budget, which I would, for Unity Asset Store assets. Would love to know your thoughts. Let me know in the comments section. The best part about having a small channel is being able to respond to each of the comments and getting at least to read them all. So I really do read everything that you guys send me, and I appreciate all the feedback. If there's more kinds of videos, a certain kind you want to watch, or certain tutorials, stuff like that, definitely let me know. Hit subscribe for more, and if you want to help me defeat the YouTube algorithm, hit the like button as well. I've heard that helps. So I'll catch you guys in the next one. Bye.